entrepreneurs remain shadowed. Here, I team up with these hidden talents to unveil their challenges and successes. Dive in with me to unearth entrepreneurial gems, learn from our experiences, and get educated. This is a dear friend of mine, Karl Tabbakh, who we've known each other for a few years now, but I was sitting going, there's so much stuff going on in the world. I was sitting in the kitchen and I was talking to Tennille one day and I was like, we got to do some podcasts or a version of podcasts or something about what's happening around North America, around the world, with the issues and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, really brainstorming. Do I put like an American and a Canadian, or, how do we create this? Do we a Republican or a Democrat or a liberal or a conservative? And I just thought to myself, oh God, that's going to be like a debate, like one of the, leadership debates. And I'm like, I don't want that to happen. And so I thought started thinking like, who could I have on that I trust in terms of their level of intelligence and experience around world affairs, and that I think like we can have a bipartisan conversation, a conversation that is like, one of my mentors always told me, and sorry audience for dragging onto this intro, but it's like, but there's a learning in this. But one of my mentors told me that, in order to be able to make a decision, whether it's business, whatever type of decision it is, but we were focused more on business, is you need to be able to argue both sides of the argument as effectively as like one side or the other side, whatever that issue might be. And if you can't, then you have not prepared yourself enough on the topic or if you're looking to buy a business, like when you look at it, like what's the upside, what's the downside, you need to be able to argue those and not be emotionally attached to them, just like a debater would be in a debating team. And so the first person that popped into my head was Karl. And so Karl, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I mean, when I say like, you're probably one of the most level-headed, intelligent people that are so well-versed that I know. And so I'm super, super grateful for your time, and your time I know is very, not only is it valuable, but there's not much of it. And so, for you to be on this podcast is not lost on me. And I hope through this conversation, it's definitely not going to be lost on the audience. So thank you, brother, for being here.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, Dwayne. And now that you've put the pressure bar so high, I'm feeling slightly nervous as well to be joining you on the podcast. But listen, great pleasure to be here. Great pleasure to be having this chat with you. And you're. What you've said, I can say the same thing, dear friend to mine, and I'm so proud of what you're doing with this, with everything you've done in your career, but with this podcast, and congratulations on that. So it's a real honor for me to be here and to have this conversation with you at times when I think from the first time we had the idea till today, probably the topics have changed about 4 or 5 times, just because the news cycles change so fast. In a way that frankly I've never seen in my lifetime, and many people haven't seen in their lifetime.
So I guess we'll have you on next week.
Yeah, exactly.
So so the audience has perspective, I just want to let me give you a little bit of, and you can fill in the gaps, Karl. I'm just kind of going to give a high level, but you've been practicing law for 20 years. You're on the senior leadership team of a law firm in Canada called McCarthy Tétrault, which is the largest or one of the largest.
We're one of the largest.
One of the largest law firms in Canada, but you're the national leader of markets and international business strategy for the company. You're one of the top 25 most influential lawyers in Canada, voted in 2023. Your experience in cross-border transactions is probably off the chart. You can Google it on the McCarthy Tétrault's website. It is. I looked it up last night actually, because we're good friends, so we don't really get into your conquests and accomplishments in law, but it was you've done billions and billions of dollars of deal structuring over your tenure of being in law, and you started a venture capital company in Dubai, and you advised on one of the largest transactions in the history of Canada, which was the takeover. It was like a $38 billion takeover from of Alcan by, I think it was Rio Tinto that took
That's
it
right.
over. But
Yeah.
and then you opened up and led the office in Abu Dhabi for one of the largest law firms at the time. You're the chairman of Invest Canada. You were the chairman of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and I think it was in 21 or 22?
21, 22.
21, 22. Like, I remember when you told me that, like, in casual conversation, I'm like, oh, okay. So, I mean, it just, and then I'm going to say this is, among all those accomplishments, you are a beautiful family man. You have a wonderful kids, a beautiful wife, Cynthia. Like, it's just so amazing to see someone who is not only so successful in their career, but successful in their home life and in their health life, which we've talked about many, many times. I mean, you're virtual stud. Like, you run, you're in shape. It's just amazing. So guys, that's Karl in a nutshell. I don't know if you want to add anything to that. I mean, the list, we could have gone on and on and on, but
I have nothing to add. Thanks, Dwayne. It's been a great journey. It's been I've been very fortunate to have had many opportunities to do very very interesting things in my life. But importantly, I've been fortunate to meet good people along the journey. And you've mentioned my wife Cynthia, obviously coming first and foremost. But people like you, people like the many mentors that I've had, you need some getting used to just getting used to someone like you talking about the journey, because I don't feel that this is the end of the journey, and I certainly feel in pretty good shape and wanting to continue doing that, and it's just been fantastic. I mean, I'm blessed, and for me to be able to contribute back is a great privilege, and doing it on a podcast like this is I feel privileged, and I'm having fun doing that. So.
When you mentioned that, I'm just curious. I think, as you know, like, I don't really plan these podcast conversations out, and I'm going to actually just say, if I look like I'm squirming around here on camera, I pinched a nerve in my back, and it's absolutely killing me. So if I end up starting to move and juggle around, I'm not getting antsy. I'm struggling here. So I just want to let you and the audience know that. But as you mentioned that about your career, and before we get into some other, issues that I'd love to chat with you about, what is, you're like just north of 50, right? 52 now? What are you?
54.
You're 54. Okay. You are the same age as I am. So when you look at this and you go, hey, and I'm just curious, because like I'm an entrepreneur, right? So it's like, I'm in it. I got no option. I'm in. Like, I can't leave. As most entrepreneurs know, it's like, there's one person that can't leave your company, and it's you. But with a guy like you who has so many options and so much like experience on the world stage, it's like, when you look at the later, the last half of your career, the last quarter of your career, however long you decide to work. I know a lot of lawyers that work into their 80s. I don't know if you're going to be in that pool or not, but it's like, what do you think? How do you manage that from a career perspective, or what the next step is? Just because I think that I know that there's a lot of corporate people who listen to the podcast. There's a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of small business owners. But we're all faced with that at some point in time. And if you're not faced with it today, you're going to be faced with it sooner or later. So I'm just curious what your perspective on that is, just because you brought it up.
I get this question quite a bit, and particularly from some of the young lawyers that either we recruit or that come to the firm, and like, how do you run your career, and how do you, like, what kind of how do you envisage the next years in your career, and how do you, I've never looked at my career as sort of being one unidimensional thing. I look at opportunities in, my horizon is probably around, what I know what I'm going to be doing for the next 3 to 5 years. And I want to make sure that everything I'm doing every year, widens the scope of my opportunities as opposed to narrows it. Both in terms of, learning. So, I want to be put in a situation where I'm learning every day, even after, been practicing now for 25 years on and off, because I've left the practice for about, 7 years when I went into business, as you've mentioned, in Dubai. But to me, having looking at the opportunities in, and I think you had mentioned that to me once, in a 5-year increment is how I've been guiding my career. Like, if I feel that I'm in a spot where I'm no longer growing as a professional, and I'm talking career wise, where I'm no longer growing as a professional, where I'm no longer learning, when I'm no longer being challenged as a leader, then this is where I think, okay, what should I be doing next? And that's kind of a different approach than looking at it from a perspective of saying, well, I want to work until I'm age X, and then I'm going to be doing this with this company, trying to, either stay the course or progress, or I don't look at it that way. I look at it from, what am I getting on my professional journey, and what am I getting on my growth journey as a professional. As a personal view, I mean, the minute you start having a family and having children, you're committed. And you're committed to it becomes more a commitment towards, their lifetime and their journey. But professionally, I'm always looking for, growth opportunities, for learning opportunities, and what I'm doing now allows me to do a lot of that. And that's why, for instance, I do more than, just the practice of law, obviously, and the leadership of a law firm, but things like accepting the appointment of by the government as a chairman of Invest in Canada adds another layer to my learning, my growth, my ability to contribute to society, but also to get something out of it professionally and personally. It makes me, I always say, these things make me a better lawyer, make me a better advisor, make me a better professional, and I think make me a better father and a better husband as well.
My takeaways there, just to kind of wrap that up, is one, looking at things in like a block. You choose 5 years. Some people do 7, some people do 10, whatever. But looking at things in a block and having a plan for a block set of time. And then the other real big takeaway there was not narrowing yourself into one narrow channel, area of focus,
100%.
which is having like some diversity in your life that allows you to grow and push yourself, that makes you a more whole person, is kind of like a bit what was probably my bigger takeaways on that. And I think that's really a really amazing point, because so oftentimes, people get into a business and that's all they focus their time on. It's either that and kids hockey or soccer or whatever they're doing. And they forget about whether it's things in the community, like, because doing something in the community today, i.e. being, in the local chamber of commerce or whatever it is, whatever your community is, it could be, the Kinsman, it could be the Rotary Club, it could be whatever. allows you exposure to other people, but it also allows you exposure to bigger worldwide organizations where you can start to learn and grow and, get a better sense of, what the world is all about, or at least outside of your own community or your own focal point of your business. So
yeah,
no.
100%. And maybe just like on that topic to close it off. The other thing that was helpful to me is what I call having a global approach and having global experiences as well. Not only from a diversity of things to do, but also from a diversity of geographies and having, obviously was born and grown up in Syria. I spent 10 years, the first 10 years of my life there, then living in Canada and growing up in Canada, but also, having worked and lived for many years, over 12 years in London and in Dubai. And, having that perspective is also I would say an important part of who I am today, being able to look at things not only from one angle, but from various angles. And for, I think for a professional or even an entrepreneur who's looking at, in today's world, like if I were to give advice to my children, being able to go and see the world, but not only see the world in terms of visiting the world, but go and live in the world and actually put that different lens on when you look at world events, when you look at problems, when you look at business or personal problems, is also a fundamental differentiator. When certainly when we look at recruiting young graduates, having had that global experience is extremely important in the world today. So I'm very grateful to the opportunities that I've had doing that.
Yeah, that's a solid point. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I wanted you on the podcast.
Yeah.
but number one, but I think a lot of young people, and this is probably a good point to make, is like they think going to the Bahamas or the Dominican Republic or Turks and Caicos for their vacation is seeing the world. It's like, that's not the world. The world is Africa. The world is the Middle East. The world is, Asia. You get out and really feel those. And if a lot of times if you can't afford, people go, well, I can't afford those kinds of trips. Well, yeah, actually you can. You can go with, you can sign up and work with philanthropic organizations to be able to go over and build a school, build houses, dig wells, whatever it is, and you're going to learn something so much. And so it's there's lots of ways to think outside the box on that stuff. And so I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think it's been important for me. It's been important certainly for my kids, and it's also like, it's a great interview question when you're interviewing somebody. What do you do when you travel? Where do you go? What do you enjoy? And you're going to get a big sense of who somebody is in terms of their mindset, their growth mindset, of whether or not they're like, well, I go to Mexico every year, or and I go to the same place every year for. It's like, okay, that that it's just a good indication of who you're speaking to and who's in front of you and what they want to learn in the world.
Yeah, and the perspective it gives you on topics and on things that we take for granted, whether it's environment and climate change, whether it's DEI, whether it's democracy, whether it's many aspects that we look at from one particular lens, in what you may call like North America or the Western world, are being looked at from a completely different lens in other parts of the world, which doesn't make their lens invalid or not relevant. It's actually a pretty good lens. But when you don't have that perspective, you're lacking the perspective of 2/3 of the world's population.
Mm-hmm.
That's very important to keep that in mind. And it's really hard in today's world, when you're living in North America, to actually get that perspective. We see the world in one particular lens. We take a lot of things for granted, and they are not necessarily the reality for the vast majority of the people on this planet.
Well, I mean, you just kicked the door open to a whole lot of topics right now, but you're right. I mean, and it's interesting. You said earlier in the podcast that you were a little bit nervous about being on the podcast, and it's like, and I actually had a little bit of nervousness this morning about it, and I was kind of like sitting on that a little bit. And it certainly wasn't nervousness with you because we're great friends, and I love you and I trust you, and I know the conversation is going to be amazing because we've had like hundreds of conversations, and every single one of them's been amazing. But it was really about my ability to be able to engage in this level of conversation that probably I suspect we're going to get into. I don't know, but what you just you have this great world travel experience, and in so many levels, both philanthropically and also from a business perspective. Um, and I think that this is an area that right now I think is impacting certainly our North American way of life is in that we're seeing strife in many areas of the world that I don't think 99% of the population in North America doesn't really understand. And then there's everything going on with politically with Trump's new administration and his agenda and what he's trying to do, to and his vision that he's trying to paint for America. And then obviously there's fallout from that, because he is definitely America focused, which I can't necessarily disagree with, and that's why I wanted to have this conversation with you, because I know that you can be bipartisan about the issues and debate both sides of it with us, and so I'm excited to kind of get into this conversation, and I'm happy to start wherever you'd like, whether it's internationally impact and how it, like, since you kicked the door in on it, it's like there's a lot of stuff going on.
You're the host. Go ahead, and I'll do my best.
No, so it's funny that you say that because, as the listeners know, this is not a conversation about what I want. It's a conversation about what you have to offer and how we're going to interact in that conversation. And so I didn't come with any real agenda, but I just know that you're so experienced and we can just go anywhere with it. So.
I think what sparked this was really everything that's happening in the world, and I think you've texted me and you said, like, with all this happening, I want to talk about stuff, and what's happening in the world today is I think certainly in my lifetime, I mean, we've seen a lot of terrible things. Yes, we've been through COVID, we've been through the world financial crisis, I remember very well the dot-com bubble bursting and all of that. But I can't remember a moment in time where, the level of unpredictability and uncertainty has been as high as it is today. And both as an observer of how things are shaping out, but also as a business leader, it is quite disturbing to try to make sense of all that, and a couple of things that come to mind. First, to me, on the geopolitics side, I think I was having a conversation with a friend, and I said, I think if World War III was to start in 20 years, historians would probably look at this period and write that all the signs were there to trigger World War III. And to me, when I was reflecting about that, I said, that's probably right. That is probably right. So we're going through a very, very serious period of upheaval, and it seems that, from that standpoint alone, things can get very, very testy. On the other hand, on the economic side, and and I agree with you. Like, Trump's agenda, if it is to put America first, This is the job of the American president to try to put America first. On the other hand, you know, America hasn't just been built by being autarcic and by being, you know, America was built on global trade, was built on global on the global markets, and I think today certainly what the business community is seeing is there's this objective of saying I want to put America first, and there's how this is being executed. And you know this, Dwayne. I mean, you can have a very, very good strategy. If you don't execute it well, it can unravel very quickly.
Yeah, it can blow up in your face.
And in business, if you have a very simple strategy, but you execute extremely well on it, your chances of success are way more, are significantly bigger. I think we're seeing today a very erratic execution from the administration that certainly is putting a lot of businesses and business people, and certainly the markets, which to me remains the best gauge and the best predictor of how things are being assessed, reacting very negatively to that, and that creates a level of uncertainty that is being reflected in the business world today. I mean, you've mentioned, obviously, we're at the center of transactions and M&A and capital deployment, and right now everyone's sitting on their hands. It's really hard to make a deal today. It's very hard as a business owner or a CEO to say, I have good visibility to be able to make a certain decision or take a certain call on either deploying capital or making a move. It's it's creating a market where there's a lot of wait and see, or people deciding to just wait on the sidelines for things to clear up a little bit. And finally, and very importantly, it's also having a significant impact on one of the main issues that, in my mind, the current administration in the U.S. was elected on, which is cost of living and inflation, and it's very difficult to see how what's being proposed now is going to solve that problem, which is a big problem, not only for the Americans, but for we've seen it in Canada as well.
Yeah. Okay. So I got like 5 things that I just wrote down that are major topics just out of that one little blurb. So you're amazing, man. So I'm going to just recap this stuff, but one, you dropped the, World War III signs. We kind of talked about America built on global markets, but also really almost all economies have been built on global markets. Negative market reaction to what's happening, decision-making in uncertain times for business owners, CEOs, entrepreneurs, and then of course, inflation and cost of living. But I'd love to just go back at the very beginning, do you mind? I'd love to, the question that popped into my head as you were saying is I'm curious, what are the signs that you see, if there was, and God forbid, knock on all wood around us, that something like that, we have a, World War type of environment. And this is not to be negative or pessimistic about what this situation is, but I think it's important for people to understand what the signs are that they may not see, or may not understand, or may want to do some research into, and as it may affect them. And we're not saying there's going to be a world war, guys. That's not the message. The message is understanding what is happening in the current environment, so that we understand the there's a consequence to every action. If you continue to spend your money, you're going to outspend your money, and then you'll be into your debt. And then if you keep on spending, you're not going to be able to afford your debt, and eventually you'll go bankrupt. That's just the way how it works. And so it's one of the things that we tried to, teach the kids, which was, there's a consequence to every action. And I'm not telling, never ever did I want, the kids to be risk adverse. I just wanted them to be aware of what the consequences were, and so I'm just curious, what would be the signs that in 20 years, if something like that happened, or maybe even the question is as simple as, what will history write about us, 20 years from now, and what this current environment has created, or where we're currently at?
Yeah. And again, like I'm not predicting World War III, and I'm not saying this is what's going to happen.
Yeah.
I'm just
If
raising.
it did.
I'm just raising a maybe a provocative question to say that there are things that are fundamentally changing in beliefs that we've been having as a society for many years. So I don't want to bore you with history or anything, but at the end of World War II, the world came together and said, you know what? We're going to put in place a framework where we're no longer going to be acquiring territory by invasion, right? So essentially, the history of humanity, which goes back to thousands of years, it's really only the last 70 years that we've collectively said to each other, okay, no more. These are the territories, and we're going to be putting a set of regulations and rules that we're all going to be abiding by. And we're not going to be accepting that, you can invade your neighbor because you want their territory. So that rule, held true, sovereignty of states. And we've decided that there are 5 big nations that are very strong and that are going to be, not only adhering to that, but in a way and enforcing it as well.
Policing it. Yeah.
Policing it. So look at what we're seeing in Russia and Ukraine. Now, I think when you look at what happened in Russia and Ukraine, and I don't want to get into the validity or the debate about that, but one thing is for certain is after this has happened, I think that world order is finished. That deal that nations had between each other, on which nations that are smaller, like Canada, for instance, right? We often hear Canadian politicians say that we believe in a rules-based world order. Of course, we believe in a rules-based world order because we don't want a world order where the stronger is, that relies on how strong you are, because then we're at a big competitive disadvantage to other military powers. So I think historians will probably write that world order, or that rules-based world order, if it's not finished, it's moved to a different configuration that has yet to be defined. So on the security front, but also on other rules. I'll give you an example. The free trade agreement between Canada and the US and Mexico is a treaty. When governments sign treaties, it's like, you and I signing a contract. You need to abide by the contract until its terms and its duration, and it has specific obligations that you need to comply with. Well, new administration comes in and says, well, I don't care about the contract that I signed. I'm going to change the rules unilaterally. That is something that was unthinkable a few years ago. When the United States or when a country puts its signature, its name on a piece of paper, on a treaty, you would be entitled to not only think that this is reality, this is enforceable, but also this is something that you can actually take as cash to the bank and make capital investments based on that, and start businesses based on that, and make some really important decisions based on the fact that this is how the world is going to work. I'm not going to be invaded. There are rules that are going to be complied with. Treaties are going to be adhered to. And that's what makes our world a world where capital comes and is deployed. Would you invest in any business if you didn't have some kind of security in terms of the regulatory framework, and knowing that what I'm telling you is black and what I'm telling you is white is white?
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, as you were saying that, I was like, you buy any business, it's like, I'm a small business owner, right? Like, but whether you're small or big, you're buying a business and you're paying a multiple of its earnings and buying its assets and all that kind of stuff, however you formulate the deal, but it's all based on the future sustainability of earnings moving forward. And, things change, economies change, whatever, but you have to, at this present moment, think about what that looks like. One of the things that I think you're saying here, and or the way I'm perceiving it is like, there's rules to the game, and in these world treaties, and or as you mentioned earlier, like, we're not going to get invaded by a bigger country. These are staple rules that have been in place for the last 70 or 80 years, and that you don't consider they're going to change. It's like, hey, if we're playing soccer, we go out onto the field and we're playing based on, here are the rules to the game, or hockey. You can't pass the puck across the blue line ahead of a player, or sorry, behind a player. So it's those are just fundamental rules to a game, and then all of a sudden, the rules change, and now we're playing a completely different game. But the question that I have on that is like, so we're seeing this happen all over the place, right? There's the Hamas, Israel, Palestinian and situation. There's Russia, Ukraine. There's what's happening in the U.S. So not to like be blaming and getting into the debate, like you said, about it, but it's like, what do you think what's happening in the psychology of the world that is causing maybe an extraordinary amount of strife, uncertainty, upheaval, drive to change the rules to the game, in across around, like, to me, that's like something has to change in a psychological fashion in order to be able to shift that narrative.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's a very it's very difficult to and I'm not smart enough to encapsulate what's changing in the world, but clearly there are a lot of people around the world, some for valid reasons and some for, and I'll get back to that, reasons that others can look at and scratch their heads around, that are feeling let down, are feeling that things are not working for them, and that's triggering many of these reactions. I don't think we can have one common answer to that. I think the reality in Palestine and in with Hamas and Israel and everything is this is completely different than, obviously, what we're seeing in Russia.
Yeah.
And it is completely different to what we're seeing in America and in the US. And to take that as an example, and to bring this back to a business reality, if you will. The gold standard for any business person was the US. You look at the indicators, unemployments, you look at growth, you look at GDP per capita, you look at GDP growth, you look at innovation, you look at productivity numbers, you look at, and you go on and on and on. And all these indicators were green, solid green. And yet, you look at the polarization in the country, and you look at what is now being presented as we absolutely need to wreck the whole place because the place is broken and things are not working. Like that narrative. It's a narrative that has been accepted by many people. But as an outside observer, you look at that and you say, well, hold on a second. This has actually been working pretty well. With 4% unemployment rate, saying that you want to bring back production to the US. You as a business person, if I tell you you're going to be setting up your next venture in a place where the unemployment rate is 4%, one of the first questions you're going to ask is, well, hold on a second, how am I going to be recruiting people here to work for me? Mm-hmm. And I'm gonna have a massive problem of recruitment. So you look at that and and it's very difficult, and I haven't found the answer yet to that. It's very difficult to understand sometimes what is driving these actions. If I were to ask, one of the questions I would love to ask someone in the U.S. administration is, in 2 or 3 years, what indicators are you going to be looking at to determine whether this has been a success or not? What indicators? Job creation, unemployment rate? Like you want to reduce it from 4 to 3 to 2? GDP growth? Productivity? What indicators are you going to be looking at that are going to allow you to determine whether this strategy has been a success or not? I would love to get the answer to that. I think the fact that people can ask a question like that and not understanding what is the actual main goal is part of the reason why it's creating so much uncertainty.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, and because and I think you're right. I think it's things were ticking along pretty good. That doesn't mean they can't be better. Any business person should know that. No matter how good things are, you can always make them better. But I had asked earlier, and I'd said what are the psychological? And when you kind of just laid that out to me, two words popped into my head, which was, and this is where, well, there was actually 3 things. So one was, and I'll just throw them out and then you can maybe address them or talk about them, whatever. But the first was, I wrote down, haves and have-nots. That, is the distance between the haves and the have-nots, is it getting so wide that we're now starting to see, that I'll call, I don't want to use the word anger, but this discontent. And then the other 2 things that I wrote down was fear and certainty. In that, is there a fear out there right now? So rather than the metrics are GDP growth, unemployment, et cetera, et cetera. Is it now more, are we moving towards this concept of this fear of, okay, COVID occurred. We realized that we were dependent on too many nations, for chips and all that kind of stuff. We, supply chains were completely disrupted, and it's okay, holy shit. this is something that needs to be fixed. And there's no question. I've talked to a lot of people who have said that, there's this movement of centralization, and I think obviously anything can be overdone. Probably maybe things got a little bit too dispersed, but was COVID an anomaly? Is that are they selling something to bring fear to people to think that they need something that they don't really need, and that globalization is the way to go, not centralization. And then the other piece is certainty. So is the U.S. reacting to fear and certainty? I guess would be, and then now and I'm not putting this on the U.S. because I live here half my year, and so and I love the U.S. Like it's amazing customer service. It's incredible. And I would have to say, and my Canadian listeners might be pissed off at me, but I traditionally get, if I had to rate the customer service I get in the U.S. versus Canada, there's no comparison. It's way better in the U.S. And so, but now we see fear in Canada, to the point where, like, one of the things that really upset me, especially when this got started off early and there was threats of sovereignty and, and the tariffs and all that kind of stuff. And we as Canadians are booing. I think she was a 10 or 12-year-old girl who was singing a national anthem at one of the sports games. And it's like, really? Like, is this what we're becoming? We're that fearful that, and I'm not saying that, these are not scary times, but to react in a way that is outside of our integrity as a nation, as a people, it is a little disappointing. But I think we all share in some of these psychological reactions of fear and uncertainty, and looking to gain certainty. And I just thought I'd throw it out there and see what kind of maybe your thought is around it.
So a couple of things. I mean, just to bring this back, or to pick up on your point around the reaction in Canada. Obviously, what happened shook some deep fundamental premises that Canadians held as true principles, right? The friendship with the US, the connections that we have with not only the country, but the people, the American people, the business environment, the access to market. When you actually look at how Canada has been selling itself to the world, it was the gateway to the North American market. The fundamental principle, or the fundamental unique sales proposition of Canada was, come and establish your manufacturing or your headquarters, your distribution center in Canada, and have access to the North American market, right? And this is the principle upon which billions and billions of dollars have been invested in Canada. Now that has been put in turmoil,
jeopardy.
In jeopardy.
Yeah.
Okay, so obviously the reaction is pretty serious, mm-hmm. right? When an enemy reacts negatively to you, you don't really care. You expect that. When someone you hold as a very, very dear friend and family reacts in that way towards you, well, obviously the reaction is going to be cathartic in a way. And listen, if reacting that way is booing a national anthem at a hockey game, I think that's probably a very mild reaction from a nation that feels threatened. So it still demonstrates, I think, the nature of Canadian people towards the Americans is, there's a resentment, there's an anger, but there's a lot of disappointment into that, and some kind of a hope that things could actually be mended at some point.
Yeah, and I think I've given this some thought because obviously I spend time in both countries. I sometimes find like, people often ask like, "Oh, what's the vibe down there? How are you being treated and stuff?" I'm like, I'm being treated like amazing. Like I mean, it's not the American people. It's like, and this is how I kind of framed it to somebody once was, it's like, I kind of feel like I'm back in grade school and my best friends, uh, parents or fathers or whatever you want, however you frame the story, are having this argument, and they're whatever it's over, piece of property or whatever, this or that, and it's like, should I not be friends? Like I'm trying to be talked into not being friends with my friend, and well, like the two dads are arguing about something that over time may solve itself. Like, and like, and at the end of the day, change in administration in any way, both sides can alter the conversation and the tone and the emotion. And so I just think, I mean, when it comes to that topic, I think we have to be very careful about pitting Canadians against Americans when it's really just an administration against an administration or a policy around. And I'm not saying it's fair. I'm not saying any of that. I have no position on, I don't really know what what they're trying to do what they're trying to accomplish. I don't think it's about tariffs, which is probably another conversation.
Yeah. So I fully agree. Like the last 2 weeks, I was in Boston, I was in New York, and I was in San Francisco and in the Valley. So, and every single conversation I've had starts with something along the lines, "Hey guys, we're really sorry what's happening. Like this is not against you. Like we
It's
don't
so
get it,
true.
right?"
Yeah, I get it all the time.
And
Hey man,
yeah,
sorry.
yeah,
We love you
okay,
guys.
yeah, we love you guys. We don't
Yeah.
know what's happening. I mean, this is just like not so obviously, this shows the strength of the bonds and the interconnectivity that we have in between the two countries, right?
Yeah.
Now that being said, things have also changed. There was a pre and there's a post. And for a country like Canada, we can't just say, well, let's see if we can kiss and make up and pretend that nothing has happened and move back to how we used to do business before, i.e., taking for granted market access, taking for granted border security, taking for granted free access to our travelers, taking for granted, et cetera, et cetera. Like those very fundamental things, we can no longer take them for granted. So there's an opportunity for the country to actually reassess the fundamental principles of its not only economic and development strategy, but also of its security and security policy. Those are so there is an opportunity in the next 10 years to do that. Now, it's also a wake-up call. I mean, you've talked about administrations. There's no doubt that the last 10 years, Canada has fallen behind significantly from an economic standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Lowest GDP per capita growth in the G7 by far. Higher inflation, problems with housing, and you name it, right? And probably, sort of some pretty strong ideological priorities that had nothing to do with stimulating, the economy, the productivity, the innovation that this country can have. No doubt, no doubt. And any new administration that's going to be elected in the next, I think on April 28th, is going to have its work cut out for it, because there are a lot of very, very serious things that need to be tackled. First among them is what is Canada as from a value proposition to investors, to capital, to business, to economic growth? How are we as a country going to be maintaining our ability to punch so much above our weight under these new rules? Particularly when our biggest client is saying, well, I want to internalize this. I don't want to buy from you anymore. I want to internalize this.
A couple thoughts. And thank you for sharing that, because they're really, really good points. And when you talked first about the I don't want to say the word betrayal, but there will be a pre and there was a pre, there's a current, and then there's going to be a post, way of doing things. And it's like, and I say this to the audience all the time. Business is a series of relationships, and it's why we talk about relationships as much as we talk about business probably on this podcast, because, and this is a really great example. It's on a macro level, but this is about how we maintain, develop relationships, how we hold our composure through the tough times. And I'll use a personal example in my personal life. I'm married. Everybody knows I'm married to Tennille. And if you've listened to the podcast, you'll know that Tennille and I were separated for almost a couple of years. And I was with someone else while we were separated. And so there was the way we did things previously in our marriage. And then, there was that, and I'll just call it adultery because we were still married. And so even though we were separated, but you can, make whatever story up you want, but that's probably the truth. As much as I don't love to admit that, but it is what it is. And then we stayed together and we worked through it. And our relationship is, it's uncalculatable how much stronger it is. And you know us personally, so you know that this is not hyperbole. This is not bullshit. Like, our relationship is next level. I maybe know one or two couples that I would say have like our kind of relationship that we know personally. It is off the fucking chart. And that turmoil, that struggle made us better. And that was, even though we were struggling, was either a decision of, do we stay together or do we be better because of this? And we chose to try to become better. And we did all the things that we needed to do to become better. And so I think that as Canadians, there's a lot to learn in this situation about, you can cast blame, but if you stay in that state, if you stay in that emotional state of casting blame and saying it's their fault and not accepting the responsibility, then you really tread on thin ice. And, in all aspects of your psychology, your emotion, and because those drive your ability to make really good decisions. And it affects the questions that you ask yourself at all levels of life, whether it's your kids, your relationships, or your business, or your country. And so I think that that is like the one kind of piece that it's like we have to maintain, like, and look, there's a lot of things that, and I think to your point about the upcoming election, and maybe we probably need that. I'd love to have a bipartisan conversation about the election coming up in Canada, of what people need to think about, because there were things in the past, and this was my point about talking about World War. It's like the history will always, it's easy to judge from a historical standpoint. Hindsight is always 2020. You can always look back, and that's the good reason to look at history, not to live in it, but to just identify, what can we learn from that, and how can we be better in the future? And this is not a political statement, but there was a time, just a few years ago, where we had an option as a country to do more trade in Europe, especially around gas. And I'm not an expert in this arena by any stretch of the imagination, so I'm kind of going by headlines. But you would know probably more about this. And we chose not to do it because it was difficult, or because it was gas and it wasn't right, or morally this or morally that. And there was a choice made at the time by the government, and I'm not you know, I don't even want to mention them because it's not about the government or who it was. It's about the thinking and the strategy of relying on. I think at one point, I think I read 70% of our exports are to the US. Yeah. Okay, so I mean, just break this down to a simple bit. You have a $1 million business that you're looking to buy, right? It would cost you maybe 300 grand to buy that business. And if one of your clients was 70 or 80% of that business, the future sustainability and predictability of those earnings goes way down if something happens to that client, or you screw it up because you gave bad service, or you weren't paying attention to the customer's needs, or you weren't being innovative in your product or in your process, or there's a million things that could happen that could disrupt that business, and it goes to zero super quickly. And how in the hell we got to the point where we got to in Canada, where we were not doing business and not searching for more business to start to reduce the reliance on, and it's not about America. It's about, you know, it's bad business.
100%. And you're putting your finger on a very, very critical point here. The client concentration that we have with the US is a problem. And you've mentioned my chairmanship of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Like this, even in those times, we kept saying, that Canadian exporters need to diversify their markets. When I used to live in Dubai, they would host these big trade shows, and you'd see that the Canadian pavilion is like a tiny, tiny little pavilion that no one would see compared to the European pavilions. And then you'd speak to some of the Canadian manufacturers, and they're like, well, yes, okay, I'd love to sell to Europe, or I'd love to sell but so that means, I need to put this into a container to ship it there. I need to, go and recalibrate my product so that it actually fits with the European standards, or the Middle Eastern standards. And then if I don't get paid, I need to, how is this going to work and everything? Whereas right now I'm selling 100% of my production. My 3 shifts are working. I got trucks lined up on the street corner, fill up a truck, it drives down the border. I get paid into my bank account at the, Canadian bank in the US. Everything is easy. And by the way, my client, we speak the same language. We play golf together. We get along. He's, he's a good guy. He's a good guy. You know, we get along.
Yeah.
I've had it. It's pretty good.
Yeah.
Right. So on one hand, the theory tells you, if you have client concentration, you've got big risk. On the other hand, we know that there are many businesses that have client concentration, but when you actually assess the risk, you put it to very, very low. And up until January 20, 2025, that risk of access to American markets was actually brought. I mean, there were hints of it during the first administration of President Trump, but it was all based on renegotiating NAFTA. Right? It was all based on, well, you know what? There are things that don't work, and we want them to work better. Fair enough. We've never envisaged that the risk would be to say, well, no, this is the actual model. We don't want this model to work anymore. Like, it's as if, you go from a franchise model or from a subcontracting model to a model where you internalize or corporatize everything. That's and I think you're going to see this is going to be a fundamental piece of the Canadian strategy. There's a reason why when Mark Carney was appointed prime minister, I think the first thing he did was travel to Europe, right? Never seen that before, right? So that's important. It's not something that that's going to be solved in a year or in 2 years, right? Because you know that you're in business, you like exporting and changing your markets and actually developing new markets requires a lot of
That's a decade process.
It-
Half a decade, and
it-
then you start sorting out the problems.
exactly.
Yeah.
And I want to just come back on your point on the energy. 100%. When big fundamental strategic mistakes, in my view, were made, not only when Germany came to buy the gas, because frankly, when Germany came to buy the gas, they needed gas now. We're not in a position to deliver gas now, not because of the decision that was made when the German chancellor came, but because of the decisions that were made prior not to actually build that. And when I was talking about, ideological decisions, you can, and I'm not going to make a point on, pro oil and gas or pro environment and, saying, am I against or for, climate? I believe in climate change. I think, hydrocarbons, are going to be disappearing at some point in the future. But, I'll give you an example to talk about that. A few years ago, I was on a business trip in Indonesia. I was in Jakarta, and I don't know if you've ever been to Jakarta, but Jakarta is a very, very crowded city, humongous, I think 25 million people. It feels very intimidating as a city, but it is very, very hot and sticky, extremely humid. And I was sitting in a briefing with the Minister of Economy, and the Minister of Economy was talking about how I think they have a population of 180 million people in Indonesia. I think they have something like 80 million people that still don't have access to electricity.
Wow.
And if you don't have access to electricity, and don't quote me on the number, but the number is very big. And if you don't have access to electricity, I can tell you, Dwayne, like just getting out of the hotel and crossing the street, you'd get drenched because it was just so hot and sticky. It's uncomfortable. So that means a lot of people that don't have air conditioning. Today, the government has a plan for building power plants. And what kind of power plants? They're building coal-fired power plants. Because that's what they can build. Same in India, same in those fast-growing places where people are aspiring to get electricity and to get air conditioning or heating or just the basic necessities of life. And when you actually look at that and you say, well, we as a country are saying we want to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. When, for instance, I think Canada's contribution to greenhouse gas emission is maybe 1%, maybe 1.2%. And let's say we want to reduce that to 1.1 or 1%. Okay, that's a valuable contribution to reduction of greenhouse gas emission. But if at the same time, we've got a coal-fired power plant pumping up every month
in Indonesia and
in Indonesia, right? Well, aren't we better off supplying them with natural gas so that instead of burning coal, they produce electricity in a cleaner way? As opposed to saying, no, but you should not develop coal-fired power plants and you should maybe think about other alternative sources, which they're not doing. Because right now, as the minister told me, he said, if you tell someone who has no electricity and no air conditioning that the planet is in jeopardy because of greenhouse gas emissions, his horizon is not 75 years.
Mm-hmm.
His horizon is
5
next season.
Yeah.
So as a country, with all the wealth of natural resources that we have, what is our obligation to the world? And what role can we play in that global objective of reducing greenhouse gas emission?
Yeah, I feel we'd be better off in education, lending engineers to develop nuclear, supplying natural gas. Like, there's so many other things that we could be putting our energy into other than, you know, getting rid of plastic straws.
I mean,
I'm not saying it's not important.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and we can do the both. You know, we can do both. Do we need, like, there are certain things. I mean, and frankly, like, do we need plastic straws if we don't have the possibility of recycling them, and they're going to end up? Maybe we don't need plastic straws, and I'm okay with that. But is our role to cut the supply of natural gas to the world so that we continue? We know today that next week there's going to be a new coal-fired power plant that's going to pop up. Shouldn't our role be to try to prevent or to replace that? I often say, so the Montreal Canadiens, my team, we just made it into the playoffs this year in the last
congratulations.
game.
I knew you guys were struggling with that. Yeah. I'll have to text France.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right. She did. No, it was fantastic.
Good
I was
for
at the
them.
game, actually.
But
it's a bit like saying to a hockey team, we need more goals. So everyone should be scoring 20 goals per year, and then we'd have a better team. But you know that's not how a team works, right? Some need to prevent goals. Some need to do some other things. And then you let the people who can score goals score goals. Now, as a world, we're saying everyone needs to reduce our greenhouse gas, and everyone is focused on their greenhouse gas emission. I mean, we even have the mayor of Montreal saying first priority of a mayor is climate change. Like, Montreal's contribution to climate change is nothing. That should not be. This is not the best use of Canada to the global greenhouse gas emission objective. That narrative is becoming very difficult to make because we're stuck into a narrative between two extremes. On one hand, sort of, green and sort of ideological climate change. And on the other hand, goes the polar opposite to that, where, everything that talks about climate change, we're, either denying it or completely ignoring some real impacts on the planet. There's a solution in between, and Canada can be a solution to that worldwide problem. We just need to take act of that. We need to understand what our strengths are as a country, and have the courage to double down on it.
Agreed. That's an interesting. So, like, when you talk about Canada, like, since we're on the topic, and we're both Canadian, and this podcast originated in Canada, but, like, realistically, 50% of our listeners are from America, and now 50% are from Canada. And so, but when it comes to the Canadian market, like, and we're in a very, this is an important position we're in right now, and we're about to elect a new prime minister. And I'm truthfully, I'll just say it straight out. I'm very bipartisan right now on this issue because I find myself at a bit of a crossroads, and I've talked to a lot of business leaders in the last couple of weeks about this topic, in that you've got, Carney, who, from a resume standpoint, looks like he is probably, potentially better at dealing with the issues at hand with tariffs and international trade and all that kind of stuff. He's definitely got more experience in it. I don't think there's any question. But he has this, there's this underlying green initiative that he has had, and that is his playbook. And that concerns me at some level. And then on the conservative side, with Polyev, it's like, is there an experience there? I don't really understand what he stands for. Like, I don't know what's been kind of what his platform is. And so I'm a little, personally, I'll be honest, I'm a little confused at what to do at the polls. And I don't know, I think I've voted, I can say, like, I think I've voted conservative. I'm a business guy, and I think I've voted conservative pretty much my whole life. I think I've voted liberal one other time, because I thought the leader was better. But, and I'm not like a hardcore right-wing business conservative guy. I do believe that we have to play our part with society, and we have to help others who need help, who can't help themselves. I do think that there are people who, are probably, leaning on what we provide a little too heavily. And it's, that goes back to the great Kennedy statement of not ask what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And I'm a firm believer in that. I don't know. I don't know where I'm interested in having the conversation. I don't want to make it, and I'm really literally trying. I'm trying to be so bipartisan about what is in front of us, because it's tough. This is going to be probably one of the most important elections we see in potentially our lifetime.
I agree with that, and I think your choice of word of bipartisan is actually the right one. I mean, unlike the U.S. and Canada, we have multi-party systems, and there was a multi-party in the sense that there was a pretty solid representation of 4 parties at the at Parliament. Over the last 4 or 5 years, with a liberal government that has been governing for the last 10 years, but 7 of those in a minority position. And when you actually think about it, more people voted conservative than people voted liberal in numbers. But the liberals with the coalition with the NDP were able to govern the country.
Mm-hmm.
And that's pretty unique to the Canadian system. I mean, it's unique to the British system, right? Because we've seen a similar thing in the UK. If you remember, when David Cameron was governing the country with a coalition with what was called the Liberal Democrats, and led to the Brexit referendum, and then to an election where the Liberal Democrats were essentially annihilated So I think the next election, we're probably going to see a stronger bipartisan, where we're going to see, regardless of the outcome, liberals and conservatives, and the 2 other parties, one being the regional Bloc Québécois and the NDP, being reduced to very, very little. Now, as to the 2 parties, I think what happened is, when you look at the polls in Canada, the last sort of when the end of last year, and until Justin Trudeau resigned, I think the Conservatives were in the lead by something like 20-25 points.
Yeah.
The level of resentment, of anger, of disappointment towards the former Prime Minister was very high, particularly in the business world, I would say. Then what happened is they picked a new leader, Mark Carney, and Mark Carney is former chairman of Brookfield. I mean, this is a business podcast. Frankly, Mark Carney would fit very well on this business podcast as a business leader, central bank, governor of Central Bank of Canada, then gets headhunted by the UK to be governor of Central Bank of England, something you don't really see very often. So the credentials and the CV are very, very impressive. And it's very rare that we see someone coming out of the business world and saying, you know what, I'm going to take this massive pay cut and do this job. Right?
That's what we wish for, right?
I mean, that's what we wish for, kind of, right? So So that's on one hand, you've got a pretty impressive CV, very accomplished individual, seems level-headed, has all the right credentials, etc. Comes on the political scene and changes a few very fundamental points, right? Conservatives were running on, well, carbon tax, the anger with Trudeau, and tax cuts, right? And then Carney came and said, okay, well, I'm getting rid of the carbon tax. I'm reducing income tax. And like a position that kind of surprised everyone, but that did one thing. It essentially removed the issues from the debate.
Mm-hmm.
It no longer it's an election like no other. No one is saying, what's the difference between these promises and those promises? They're all now pretty much offering similar things. Now it's been reduced to, I think the Canadians on the April 28 are going to be getting into the polling station. I'm wondering, okay, who do I think is going to be standing to Donald Trump, and who's going to be able to chart the strategic course of the country for the next several years? If you ask me personally, I think it's the latter is more important than the former. Standing up to Trump, yes, okay, it's important, but no one's going to really stand up to Trump. Is a different leader? Can he command more better respect? I think we saw it with the phone call that Carney had. No longer references to governor and no longer references to 51st state, etc., etc. So there seems to be, the personality of the individual can command some respect. But to me, the critical thing that I will be looking at when casting my vote, which I'm not going to tell you who I'm going to be voting on this website, but on this podcast, but the fundamental point I'm going to be looking at is who is going to be in a better position to put our strategic plan or our vision for the next 5 to 10 years as a country. And if we get this wrong, this can take a completely different tangent. But if we get this right, I believe this is one of the best countries to be not only living in, but investing in.
Yeah. No, and I agree with that. And oftentimes people ask me, like, what does it take to build a business, or, a variation of that question? And I always have a consistent answer of 3 things. First one, vision. The second one is will. Do you have the will to go and execute? Like, are you actually going to get up every day and do what you say you're going to do? And do you have the resources available to fight the fight that you need to execute on your vision, to be able, like, do you actually have the resources, or are you going to get halfway through and run out of steam, run out of money, run out of people, run out of whatever product, whatever? And I think it's not much different and that's, I was going to ask you, like, what do people, and I think you've answered it already, but it's like, what are people going to have to ask themselves when they're in that polling station? And it's not for us it's like, I'm not going to tell people what I'm going to vote for either, because I would never want to sway anybody's opinion based on, they said they're going to do this, so I should do that. And it's like, well, that doesn't mean it's the right decision. It is, who do you have faith in that's going to execute the vision, have the will to do it, and is going to be able to create the resources and the people. And people is probably the most important resource, truthfully. You can get capital anywhere, but it's people. It's resourcefulness, your thinking, your state of mind. And truthfully, at some point, I don't think I've even made my decision fully yet, to be honest with you. But I do think it's, Yeah, it's like, oh, okay, I got the pen in my hand and I got to draw an X. Or so, but I do think, like, is there any other thing that like we can? And I think I'm gonna say this to the listeners: like, you have to go out there and do your own research. And for God's sakes, well, a couple things. Number one, frickin' vote. Like, I mean, you can't not sit there and say, well, I don't know what to do, so I'm not going to do anything. Like, that's just abdicating. And then don't bitch about what happens. I'll just say that, like, if you guys are listening to this, and not only should you be voting, and you probably will, because if you're listening to this podcast, you have a growth mindset, so you'll go and vote. But the people around you, the people who work for you, give them time off to go to vote. Like, do the right thing when it comes to making sure people are voting. And then the other is like, where do you go to do the research so here's another topic. It's like, what media sources do you trust that you're getting the right information from, to know exactly where the different parties or the different leaders of those parties stand on those topics? And then actually, I'd probably have one other question for you too, which is something I was not happy about. This is not, I'm not being critical of a party, but I wasn't happy when the coalition occurred between the Liberals and the NDP. It's like that to me really made me feel like, there was some feelings of like, maybe we should be a two-party system, because it's like, then there isn't a coalition. Because if you don't get a minority, or if you don't get a majority, you don't deserve to be able to make all the decisions. And then you have to reach across the table and figure out a way, because that's what the Canadian people wanted, or that's what the voters wanted. It could be in America, whatever. But it's like, we've got this, like, to be able to go and basically form yourself a majority by creating a coalition is not, to me, like, that doesn't represent, well, honestly, it doesn't represent the Canada that I grew up in, I don't think. That might be a strong statement for some, but it's not a political statement. It is not a political statement. If it happened the other way around, I'd feel the same way. Yeah. So yeah, the question was, like, I wasn't happy about the coalition and what happened in that situation. And, I don't want to be, I mean, I always think I risk on the side of judgment and take an opinion too quick and stuff like that. So I'd be curious on your take on it.
To me, we've had, I mean, first of all, we're not the only country that has coalitions, right? Europe is notorious for that, and the UK has been like that. We've had some really solid minority governments. I think in the past instance, one of the problem was that for a coalition to work, whoever is prompting a minority government needs to have some strength, to have some leverage. In this case, I think I think the NDP were not in a very strong position. They weren't necessarily ready to go to the polls and to defeat the government, and that is why this minority government lasted for so long. Usually they say minority government duration is roughly 18 months. This one went the distance, almost 4 years. And I think in this case, and historians and political scientists will write about that, and then they'll have a better analysis. But I think a big part of the reason was the fact that the NDP just did not have the capabilities to actually send the government into an election, because they were just too, I think their prospects and their polls were not great for an election. But I think beyond the actual system, we need as a country to start questioning some fundamental premises. Not only at the federal level, but more importantly at the provincial level, where essentially the country takes shape, right? When we talk about social programs, when we talk about healthcare, when we talk about education, when we talk about infrastructure, this is all done and funded by the provinces in a way, and delivered by the provinces. And I think, you know, we need to change the mindset.
Hey, everybody. Thanks very much for listening. Catch us next week with the continued conversation with Karl Tabbakh about everything going on in the world today. It's an amazing, insightful conversation with such a steady state gentleman. And I use the word gentleman because he truly is. So listen in where we talk next week about more issues and also opportunities that lie ahead and how to handle these times, looking for the opportunity, not just the gray cloud. So guys, thanks very much for listening. We'll see you next week. For Karl Tabbakh, thanks very much. God bless.